Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
True crime with a dash of the paranormal, the garish, the strange, and the darkly comic. I'm Zevin Odelberg, host of Kinda Murdery, a podcast that's about more than just murder. It's my very own pocket dimension, home to a curated collection of bizarre and compelling stories. The unsolved, the unsettling, and the unbelievable. I cover it all, just so long as it's kinda murdery. Welcome everybody. I am Zevin Odelberg, and this is Kinda Murdery, and I am glad that you are here. Along the lines of the case of the Disappearing Parrot, I am bringing you another Ellis H. Parker mystery. I found this one in the December 1928 issue of True Detective magazine, and I'm going to start telling it to you right now. I will say that this time around, I'm going to pass on doing my amateur New Jersey accent, so as you may recall, Ellis H. Parker was the chief of detectives for Burlington County, New Jersey, and he liked to tell his stories to Alan Hine from the Boston Post. Last time, I did my best, like I said, amateur Jersey accent. This time, Parker will just be speaking with my voice, but hopefully you'll forgive me for that. Alright, let's do it. If you're ready, please join me as we uncover what truths we can and solve what mysteries we may. Kinda Murderies. The Cry from the Grave, an Ellis H. Parker mystery, part 1, starts now. Moorestown, New Jersey is a quiet, beautiful Quaker settlement much the same as thousands of other small American communities. Along about dusk, the children drop their play, scurry home to their evening meal, and then go to bed. Nobody would pick Moorestown as the scene of a dastardly crime. Still, it was there, in Moorestown, that I encountered a case of killing perpetrated by a man who was beyond all doubt the most fiendish and cunning arch-criminal that I have ever come in contact with during 35 years of manhunting. First, allow me to give you a little bit of the background to the case, which had me baffled for almost 5 months. Alfred and Charles Russo, 11-year-old twins, were returning to their home in Moorestown after having attended a baseball game on Saturday afternoon, June 4th, 1921. It was about 6 o'clock in the evening. At the corner of 3rd Street and Chester Avenue, half a block from their home, they saw their sister Matilda, who would soon have been 8 years of age. Matilda was one of the most beautiful children that God ever made. She possessed an abundance of beautiful dark hair and had large, laughing brown eyes. She would have been an ideal model for an artist. She was so startlingly pretty, in fact, that strangers often stopped her on the street to ask her name and sometimes called upon her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Michael Russo, with a view of becoming better acquainted with the little girl. Side note, this sounds a little creepy with all the awareness that we have today in 2024, but let's pretend, at least for now, that was an ordinary sort of occurrence in 1921 and keep pushing forward with the story. I do fear, though, that it is going to turn out to be pretty freaking creepy. Alright, back to it. Because of people's fascination with Matilda, her parents, highly respected people, made many new friends. Her parents being Mr. and Mrs. Michael Russo. Mr. Russo, the father of a large family, owned the leading tailoring establishment in Moorestown. On that Saturday afternoon, when Charles and Alfred saw their sister, she was playing a game on the sidewalk. Hopscotch, I think it was. She was alone. "Better come on home and get washed up for supper, sis," said Charles. "No, don't want to," answered Matilda. "Something terrible will happen if you don't," warned the brother, little realizing just how true his words were. Oh no. "Won't come home," insisted the little girl. "All right," said Charles, going on his way with Alfred. "Just you see what happens." Matilda laughed and went on with her play. Not long afterward, Matilda's father, on his way home from business, saw his little girl still playing as only a happy child can play. "Come on home, Matilda, dinner'll be ready." "Please, let me finish just this last game, Daddy." Mr. Russo laughed, consented to Matilda's finishing the last game, and left the child. That was the last time that any of the Russos ever saw little Matilda alive. For even as the child played, A fiend was putting the finishing touches on a grave. When Mr. Russo came downstairs to dinner after changing his clothes, he asked if Matilda had returned yet. On being informed that she had not, he said that he would let his dinner wait while he went out and brought her in. When he reached the spot where he had last seen Matilda, the child was not there. "Matilda!" shouted the father, who afterwards said to me that something within him told him that some evil had befallen his daughter. There was no answer. Although fearful of some mishap, Mr. Russo pulled himself together, thinking that Matilda was playing one of her jokes on him, and searched the vicinity. He hoped against hope, as the minutes wore on, that he would find the little girl hiding behind a tree, ready to spring out at him, laughing at his discomfort. He searched, and he searched, but the hunt was unrewarded. The Russo home sat far back from the street, as did most of the homes in that section of the town. On one side of the Russo residence was a small house occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Lewis Lively and their 8-year-old son, Louis. The Liveleys were an African-American couple. They were very light in color, and that was one of the reasons that they were permitted to live in the locality in question. Remember, once again, this is 1921, and it's a first-person story, so these aren't my descriptions. The Liveleys were well thought of in the neighborhood. After searching for his daughter for more than half an hour, Mr. Russo stopped at the Lively home to ask if his child had been seen. Lively, sitting on his back porch, said that he had seen Matilda only an hour previously while she was playing, but that he had not seen or heard the child since he had eaten dinner. When Mr. Russo arrived back at his home and found that Matilda had not returned, he called the Moorestown police, notifying them of her disappearance. The Russos and the police spent the remainder of the evening calling up friends and relatives of the Russos to see if Matilda had gone away with them. People living near the Russos were also questioned. Late that night, Mrs. Russo was doing some ironing and her mind had momentarily wandered from her thoughts of her missing daughter when suddenly she heard the child call, "Mother!" Instantly, Mrs. Russo rushed into the yard and called, "Where are you, Matilda?" No answer. The mother repeated her question and the neighbors heard her. There was still no answer. "That's strange, Michael," said Mrs. Russo to her husband when she returned to the house. "I was sure I heard Matilda calling me." The next day, Chief of Police John Bradshaw of Moorestown called me by phone while I was at my home in Mount Holly, several miles away. After the usual hellos and identifications, Chief Bradshaw said, "There's a little girl been missing from her home since early last night. Listen, Ellis, it looks funny. We can't seem to find any trace of her. What would you advise?" "Get a picture of the girl," I said, "and have it put in the Camden and Philadelphia newspapers along with a detailed description of the child. If you run across anything that looks strange, call me at once." On the following morning, Chief Bradshaw again called me by the phone. "Still no trace of the missing girl, Ellis, but the mother insists that she heard her child's voice in the neighborhood. You better come down, I think." I at once got in touch with some of my staff, Detective Clifford Kane and my secretary, Miss Anna Use, now, as you've heard recently, Miss Herman Bating, who is quite indispensable to me because she can always be depended upon to give me the woman's point of view. Anna, although she is now married, is still my secretary, and in her quiet way she often notices things that I overlook and then suggests them to me, and it was Anna who played a rather important part in the solution of the Russo case, as you'll find out later. Arriving in Moorestown, we all three went directly to police headquarters where I learned the facts that I have already related to you. We then proceeded to the Russo home. The family was, of course, naturally much upset. When I talked to Mrs. Russo, a woman of high intelligence, she told me that she knew her child was dead. I tried to comfort her. After all, my many years of detective work have not made me so hard-boiled that I've forgotten the essential things of life, paramount among which are courtesy and the consideration for others. I appreciated Mrs. Russo's state of mind, for I have a large family of my own. And, as I say, I tried to comfort her, telling her that Matilda might have gone off with a relative or a friend who had picked her up in a car, and who had been unable to communicate with the child's parents for some reason. I had located many missing children, well and happy, days after they disappeared, I assured her. "Don't try to comfort me, Mr. Parker," said Mrs. Russo. "My child is dead, and I know it." "But why are you so sure of that?" "Because I hear her screaming for me day and night." "Where are the screams coming from?" "From the direction of Mr. Lively's house," she answered. Chief Bradshaw and I then decided to make a search of the Lively house. It was a 2.5-story frame affair. There were only 2 rooms and a kitchenette on the first floor and 2 rooms on the second floor. Above the second floor was a loft, which was reached by means of a trap door through the ceiling of the front second-floor room. We went through the house, starting with the loft and working downward. We also searched the cellar, but all it contained was a big pile of rubbish in the center of the floor, and a couple of aged-looking pillows. The rubbish had cobwebs all over it, indicating that it had been there for some time. We decided that no one had been in the cellar for weeks. The rest of the house yielded no clue of any kind which would help us in clearing up the mystery of Matilda's disappearance. I was firmly convinced that the child had strayed away, so I spent the remainder of the day combing the ground in the vicinity. But when I returned home that night, I was at a complete loss to account for the child's whereabouts. No sooner had I arrived home and finished my dinner than the phone rang. It was Chief Bradshaw. "Mrs. Russo just called me and insists that her little girl screamed for her from the Lively home a few minutes ago. She wants you to search the place once more." "I'll be down in the morning, Chief," I replied. Shortly after 9 o'clock the next morning, Tuesday, Chief Bradshaw and I again entered the Lively home through a side window. Lively had gone to work and his wife and son were away on a visit. We latched the window after gaining access to cover up our tracks. Well, that second search was a pippin, if I do say so myself. We were in the place for several hours and went over every inch of the house, it seemed. Once more we started from the top and worked down. I took a flashlight and went through the trap door in the second-floor ceiling. But I saw at once that nobody had been in the loft because every bit of dust and dirt was intact, exactly as it had been before. There was not the slightest sign of a footprint or a fingerprint except those which I had made during my first visit. We then searched the 2 bedrooms on the second floor. We tapped the walls for the possibility of locating a secret panel, but to no avail. The same process was repeated with the first floor, with the same result. We then descended the cellar steps. I stood at the bottom step and surveyed the place critically. The cellar was about 14 feet square. The floor was earthen. There was positively nothing in the place but that pile of cans in the center and the 2 pillows to which I've already referred. We tapped the ground where it was not covered by rubbish, and it was all as solid as a concrete wall. I examined the pillows. Feathers oozed out from one and straw from the other. This gave both of them the earmarks of having been there for some time. I then kicked part of the rubbish pile lying in the center of the floor and noticed that it was literally covered with cobwebs and small bugs. This was a clear indication, I decided, that the rubbish had not been touched for some time. We tapped the cellar walls and gave ourselves headaches trying to think of a single spot in the house which we had not covered. We then concluded that the house was going to give us no clue as to the child's whereabouts. The rest of the day was devoted to convincing Mrs. Russo that we'd made a thorough search of the Lively home, dragging the nearby streams to see if the child had accidentally fallen in the water and been drowned, and combing the woods in the surrounding country. We even went so far as to organize several troops of Boy Scouts who scoured a wide stretch of the territory in hope of finding some trace of the missing girl. By this time, the case was getting under my skin, so to speak. On the previous Saturday, the day of Matilda's disappearance, Lively had left his home at night on his motorcycle. He usually spent the weekend with his sister in Bridgeton. His wife and son had gone to Bridgeton a week previous. Lively was expected home Tuesday night, so I left word with Chief Bradshaw to have him questioned upon his return, in the hope that he might shed light on the case. I returned to Mount Holly. On the way back, my secretary said that she thought it was queer that Mrs. Russo heard her daughter's voice with such frequency. I said I did too. I felt that something was going to materialize from that phase of the case. Late that night, Chief Bradshaw called me by telephone and informed me that Officer Jacobs, lying in wait at the Lively home, had seen Lively return shortly after 7 o'clock. When the officer asked him to accompany him to the police headquarters to make a statement, Lively said that he was more than willing to do so. I told Chief Bradshaw to have the man's statement transcribed and bring it to me. Chief Bradshaw arrived at my home early Wednesday morning with the statement. Lively had given a very plausible account of his movements prior to, at the time of, and following the girl's disappearance. The man said that he'd returned home from work Saturday afternoon, cooked his own dinner, and then left on his motorcycle to visit his sister in Bridgeton over the weekend. His wife and son, as I have already mentioned, had gone to Bridgeton some days previously. Lively, who said that he was employed as a brushmaker by a concern in Philadelphia, went into great detail regarding his trip. He named the various towns he passed through, what time he was at certain points along the road, and whom he saw and spoke to en route. He said that he arrived at his sister's home fairly early in the evening. I looked over Lively's statement rather carefully. I noticed, among other things, that the man had voluntarily given minute details without being asked for them. This made me suspicious, as the advancing of an alibi, when not required, is usually a sign that something is in the wind. So I suggested to Chief Bradshaw that he take his motorcycle and go over the same route that Lively took, checking out the time and mileage between the various towns very carefully. I also told the chief to get statements from the people that Lively had said he had talked with or had seen, and also to check the time of his arrival at his sister's home in Bridgeton. Chief Bradshaw completed the task and called me on late Thursday. We found several discrepancies in Lively's story of his trip. In the first place, we found that it would have been physically impossible for him to make the motorcycle run from Moorestown to Bridgeton in the time that he said he did it in. Secondly, the man had not talked to the people he said he'd talked with. Others that he claimed to have seen were not even in the vicinity on the Saturday previous. Finally, the man's sister said that he arrived at her home late Saturday night, not early evening as he'd stated. That night I was pretty restless. I didn't go to bed because I knew I wouldn't sleep if I did. My wife asked me what was on my mind. "I'm upset about this little girl's disappearance," I replied. "There's something strange about it. The mother of the girl insists that she hears her child calling her." To say that I was greatly impressed by Mrs. Russo's story that she heard her child's voice is putting it quite mildly, especially as I had been thinking of another case several years before, when a similar situation presented itself. On that occasion also, I was searching for a missing girl. The child's mother kept telling me that she heard her daughter's voice. We later found the body. The child had been drowned at a spot a mile away from her home. The mother insisted that she had heard her child calling her at a time which was definitely fixed later as having been after the child had been drowned. The wind was blowing in a direction away from the mother, so she couldn't possibly have heard the child's actual screams. But still, she heard her dead child, and she knew where the screams were coming from. The more I thought of this, applying it to the Russo case, the more it loomed in importance. Then it dawned on me suddenly that I might have been fooled during the search of the Lively home. So I called Chief Bradshaw on the phone, got him out of bed, and told him to go to Jim Taggart, the leading blacksmith of Moorestown, have a spear made, and then go over every inch of the Lively cellar after Lively went to work that morning. Call it a hunch or whatever you prefer, but something told me as I finally went to sleep toward the morning that we were going to locate Matilda's body in a very short while. I determined, and correctly, that Mrs. Russo heard the voice of her dead child, and today, 7 years after this case, she will tell you the same thing. On Friday morning, therefore, shortly before 7 o'clock after Lively had gone to work, Chief Bradshaw and Officer Jacobs gained access to the house in the same manner that the chief and I had entered before, through a side window. As the place sat far back from the street, there was no difficulty entering unobserved at any time. Entering the dark, musty cellar, 2 officers began to spear the ground not covered by rubbish. They did their work in a very systematic manner, and there was not an inch of the earthen floor that was not gone over. However, the ground proved to be as solid as concrete. Then they removed the pile of rubbish from the center of the floor, and the ground under this at first glance appeared to also be as solid as the rest. It did not show any evidence of having been dug into. But when Bradshaw poked the spear into it, the instrument sunk. Excitedly, the 2 men got a spade, and Chief Bradshaw dug feverishly, while Officer Jacobs looked through the displaced earth for a bit of clothing or anything suspicious. Nothing was found. Was this effort to result in nothing? Still they dug on. A depth of 3 feet had been reached. Suddenly the spade struck something soft. Dropping to their knees, the officers removed the earth rapidly with their hands. And if you want to find out what they found, please join me next Thursday, May 16th, for Part 2 of A Cry from the Grave, an Ellis H. Parker mystery. Until then, I'm Zevon Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery.
If you like the show, please subscribe, review, and tell your friends. You can find us on social media at Kinda Murdery or email at kindamurdery@gmail.com.